We're going to get started. Thank you everyone for coming out. This is our workshop for Enventure on grants for life science entrepreneurs. So if you're interested in finding some funding for your idea that you'd like to translate to a company, you've come to the right place. We're really lucky to have Paradigm Partners with us tonight. Their grants department is going to give us a crash course essentially in what grants to apply for and what they're looking for and how you can get a really stellar grant. So I'll turn it over to Jacob and his team, and we're really excited. So thank you for coming out.
All right, thank you, Amy. And like she mentioned, we're from Paradigm Partners. I have Melanie and Kian here joining me for the grants team. We're here in Houston, down the road off I-10. And just to get an idea of the crowd here, how many are students right now, currently? And how many of you have a master's or a PhD in the science field? Okay. How many have MBAs? How many have law degrees? No law degrees. How many are overachievers like Melanie here and have more than one degree, MS and MBA or something like that? Okay. And do we have any professors in the crowd? Nope. One professor, two professors. Okay. Good to know. So I'll try to revise as we go along according to the crowd here. But what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, why grants? Why grants for small businesses? And what grants are available for small businesses? We're going to go down and describe the registration that you have to do and talk a little bit about the application process, the application form, the budget form. We'll provide some grant writing advice, and at the end we're going to have an example case study of small business grants and have you assess them, which should help you assess your own products or projects or eventual future products or projects. Big disclaimer, since it is a crash course, that means you have to do a lot of the homework on your own. There's no way in half an hour we can describe all about the grants world. So if you have questions during this for clarity, like brief questions, ask them, but at the end, after my presentation, we'll open up to questions, and then we'll go into the case study after that. And we also have a resources section at the end. A lot of the pictures and examples on here are from these websites, and we will make this available on the Enventure website through Amy after this. So don't worry about that. You don't have to furiously write down anything. So why grants for small businesses? Top 5 reasons here. Number 1, it's not a loan. You don't have to repay it. Number 2, it's non-dilutive. You don't have to give up your ownership like you would for venture capital funding. Number 3, you don't have to give up your IP. You get to keep all that. The government may use it, but they don't take it from you. Number 4, it provides seed money for your high-risk projects. So if you get seed money from the government, there's less guilt associated with that than getting it from your family and friends for your high-risk projects, right? So that's a good thing. Number 5, also different from getting money from family and friends. You get recognition, you get verification, and you get visibility because you get a grant from the government that says, 1, you got reviewed by scientists across the country and they liked your project a lot. 2, the government liked it enough to put their stamp on it and says, this is NIH approved or NSF approved grant money. So it can be a very positive achievement for your company. What grants are available? The answer truly is a bunch are available. So this is grants.gov. A lot of federal grants are listed on here. I searched cancer here. I came up with 130 open opportunities. That's a lot. You guys don't want to read through that. So we're going to try to break it down for you today. And let me show you why you don't want to read through it. So what you want to do is say, what grants are available to small businesses that I have a chance to win? And that's very important here. Looking at these right here, first one, for NCI designated cancer centers. You're not that. Mark that off the list. Number 2, health disparities U01. A U01 is a big grant application that if you've never applied for grants before, you don't want to start with that one. And I forgot to ask this before. How many of you have applied for a grant before or contributed to one, like through your professor, through your lab, anything? Okay, so you guys are familiar with, is it NIH grants? R01s? R21s? Okay, good to know. So you guys are somewhat familiar with that. For For small businesses, you don't want to mess with that. R21, it's a step below R1s, right? So that's kind of a maybe. If you have to do an R-type grant, R21 is kind of a maybe for small businesses. The fourth one here, Breast Cancer Postdoc Fellowship Award. You're not a postdoc. Rid of that. All right, I guess some of you could be, but if you're a small business, you're not a postdoc. So finally, a PO1. You guys have done R1s. A PO1 is like 3 of those all at once. Again, something a small business doesn't want to mess with. So, absolute #1 best grant for you as a small business, SBIRs and STTRs. And that stands for Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer. And let me tell you why they're the best. So, a lot of you are in school still. You have professors. They have hundreds of publications. It's publish or perish. So it's basically their job to get grants, write grants, get the funding, and then publish or perish. That's their job. They have a lot of publications. As a small business, you don't want to compete with that. What you want to compete with is other small businesses. You want to level the playing field. So fortunately for you, the government has these SBIRs, STTRs. Only small businesses can apply. You eliminate this competition from Rice and from UT Austin and Harvard, etc. And a very important thing also, we're talking about R1s, you guys are familiar with R21s. That's for basic research, right? It's for proving like basic scientific research. SBIRs, they fund research and development, R&D, where the end goal is commercialization. So it's made specifically for small businesses. They want you to commercialize. If it looks like you're not going to commercialize, they're not going to fund it. So that's the reasons why SBIR is better. And the agencies that fund SBIR are many. As you can see here, there's 12 of them. Today, you guys are all, or most of you are life sciences. So we're going to focus on the 3 main ones. Primary one is NIH, National Institutes of Health. You guys seem to be familiar. There may be opportunities for you at NSF and DoD also. Okay, so eligibility for SBIR specifically. I'm going to start from the easy to achieve and go down to the harder to achieve. So #1 is for-profit located in the U.S. #2 is less than 500 employees. And I'm pretty sure everybody in here is okay with that. #3, ownership. You need to be owned at least 50% by individuals. So that means a big company can't buy your small company and own it for 100%, or you're ineligible. One note is some solicitations, including NIH SBIRs, allow you to be more than 50% owned by multiple VCs and those types of companies. But that's only a few. You still cannot be owned by a single VC company more than 50%. All right, so now eligibility in terms of facilities and PI, which stands for Principal Investigator. So first, the facilities aspect and the budget aspect. At least 67% of the budget must go through the small business. And that means it must go through your employees, small business employees, and through your facilities, which need to be under your control. Control meaning you have a key, you can lock it and keep people out. And a lot of people are virtual early on as a startup. You are still eligible if you can say, if we get this award, we're going to lease these facilities and have these available to us and do work in here for the grant. In terms of the principal investigator for SBIRs, the PI must be employed at least 50% time at the small business. So on here, you know, we show your, yeah.
What about co-working space?
Co-working spaces. If you can make a strong argument for it, that you have control and do the work in there, that may be okay. But the company, if it's a co-working space like at a university, okay, with different companies.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Probably
probably
it's privately owned.
okay.
And they bring in citizen scientists or even postdocs where they spend their own time, not university funded, but their own
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that should be okay. Okay, so your professor here, say you graduate, you start a small business based on your university research. Your professor obviously is an expert in the field. So it's good to get him on the grant and have him, let's say, serve as a consultant or maybe perform some of the work at his lab. But for an SBIR, he can't be the PI unless you actually hire him over to the small business. So the difference, SBIR and STTR, STTR, it requires a partnership between your small business and your research institution. So the percentages change where now only 40% needs to go through the small business, and at least 30% can go through the university. So that means you can have 60% of the budget go through your old professor in that university. Another good thing is your old professor can actually serve as the PI for that, because for STTR, they don't have to be employed 50% time at the small business. And this is for NIH. For NSF, they actually still need to be employed at the university. So again, we're focusing mainly on NIH, and I encourage you to look at each solicitation to get the fine details. Okay, dollar signs, which a lot of you are probably interested in. So SBIRs, there's typically 3 phases. Phase 1, shown here, is feasibility. You're proving the feasibility of your product enough that they want to fund you for phase 2. It's typically $150,000 to $225,000 a year for a year, 6 months to a year. If you do well there, you can apply for phase 2, which is typically $1 million to $1.5 million total, spread over 2 years. So you add these up, that's getting close to $2 million for an SBIR, which is a substantial amount of money. Quick note, fast track, you can apply for a fast track where instead of proposing phase 1 only, you propose the entire thing, phase 1 plus phase 2. We don't recommend that for starting off, because the bigger your application, the more likely there's going to be a hole in it that one reviewer is going to spot and snag and just tear it down. Phase 3, the government typically says you're on your own there. That's your commercialization stage. There are some cases where you could repackage your project as proving another feasibility project in phase 1, but that's typically how it works. So now we've talked about SBIRs, we've given an overview. Now we're going to go through the steps to identify an opportunity that you can go after. So again, for you guys, NIH is the first place to look. And the first step would be to look at the omnibus solicitation of SBIRs, and there's also one for STTRs. This is also called the parent. It's like the parent R01, parent R21 for you guys that are familiar. So essentially, on this solicitation, they have a link here to a PDF where it has all the interests of all 27, I think it is, agencies that, you know, National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Aging, etc. So as long as your project, your company project, fits with one of those topics, then you can pick your own project. It's called investigator initiated. You can pick your project and apply to the omnibus. What we recommend is, if you look at the topics, you see there's a match, is find the appropriate institute or center and find their scientific research contact, which is listed on the solicitation. Call them up, email them, tell them about your project, maybe give them a one-page summary, and make sure that they're on board and they're excited about it. Because how the review process works, most of the professors review your application with some business people. If they think it's good enough, think it should be scored, it goes to the NIH. They make the final decision, especially if it's borderline. So if it's a topic that NIH doesn't really care about, you're borderline, then it's probably not going to make it past that. So after the omnibus, you want to check the special solicitations, which are more specialized, or more specific. So a couple weeks ago, there was 54 records, or 54 current SBIRs or STTRs available. This very first one, it's on early diagnosis, monitoring, treatment of micro and macrovascular complications of diabetes. So that's a very specific topic. There's also topics like antimicrobial catheters. There's topics like research tools for investigators. So there's many different topics. So check all those out. One thing we will say is even if you find a match, make sure it's a really strong match because, again, the parent, you can suggest your own project, whereas one of these specific ones, you better align exactly with what they say or they're not compliant. So I mentioned review the topics, call NIH. Another thing you can do, and you guys may be familiar with, is use NIH Reporter, which you can use search terms and search your topic, like we were saying cancer earlier, breast cancer, etc. And you can see awards that were already given for SBIRs and STTRs. Or if you know a company doing similar stuff, you can see what they got awarded for and make sure that NIH is interested in it. Another interesting feature that you guys may not be familiar with because it's pretty new, I think a couple months old, is Matchmaker. So you can paste in an abstract, and then it spits out the main institutes and centers. You can't see this very well, but that's NCI, NIDDK, etc. It gives the activity codes, R01, P01, R43 shows up, which is SBIR. Then it gives the study sections, which when you're sending in grants, you want to suggest in your cover letter which study section you should go to. And then finally, if you're not familiar, the reporter search comes up with the type of grant, the name of the grant. You click on it, you can read the abstract. And again, see if NIH has funded similar things in the past. And at the same time, hopefully this won't happen to you, but hopefully you won't find your project that's already been played out on the report. Okay, so that's basically the rundown on NIH, SBIRs. NSF is another place to look. The main difference with NSF, though, is they are not disease-focused like NIH is. If you have a project on diabetes, don't take it to NSF because they're going to reject it. They want more platform-type stuff, more early-stage stuff. And again, I suggest you look at these solicitations and look down the list. Real quick, a rundown on the typical dates. NIH is December, April, August, 3 times a year. NSF is usually 2 times a year. It's usually December and June. DoD is typically 3 to 4 times a year. They kind of move around. So these change a little bit each time for NSF, but just a couple examples related to health. Here's a smart health one. Here's a pharmaceutical manufacturing one. So again, it's not a specific drug. It's not a drug for cancer or diabetes, but it's new processing or manufacturing devices just to help that manufacturing sector. So again, it's more platform, more broad scale. It's not disease focused.
Funding level the same, similar between DoD, NIH, and
They're mostly all between like 10 and 20% for SBIRs. It really depends. For NIH, it can be very different between institutes, but it's typically 10 to 20%.
Are you talking about the rate of funding, the percentage rate, or
No,
the
just the
total amount?
just the normal allocations.
For total budget, NIH does go higher. It goes 150K to 225. Well, NSF STTRs are 225, but the SBIRs are 150. And that may change because they seem to be inching up to it. Other agencies, for example, one of the obscure ones that we don't deal with usually, but like Homeland Security or something like that, I think they're at 100 or even lower. So it depends on the agency. Okay, so yes.
My experience in with NIH, the grants are more focused on a product-oriented or therapy-oriented, and like you said, that NSF is more oriented towards platform technology, early stage, right? What I know of NSF, not the SBIR grants, but the regular other grants that we write. For NSF, they are more focused on discovering a mechanism, for example, which has nothing to do with that. In fact, if you actually put in the grant, if the orientation of the grant is more towards that you will develop a product out of it, or it doesn't have a discovery objective, then they don't want it in a normal grant. Is that also the case for NSF SBIR grants? Because they have to be towards commercialization. They cannot
Right.
be towards discovery, but how do they differentiate between the two?
No, that's a great point. So after we go through the SBIRs, we're going to go through some non-SBIRs. NSF, that's not one we recommend because from what we hear, we never even tried it for companies because you're right, they just like basic research. They fund professors, universities. They don't fund companies for non-SBIR stuff. However, for SBIR stuff, they absolutely do. And an interesting thing is, so we go through NIH in this presentation, but NSF, they actually require I think it's 3 to 5 page commercialization section in your phase 1. NSF, on the other hand, NIH on the other hand, doesn't require any of it. We usually recommend at least a paragraph, but they don't require any of it. So NSF is actually more commercialization focused in phase 1 than NIH is. Does that answer your question? Okay, so DoD. I mentioned NIH specialized topics. DoD has even more specific topics. So when they have a solicitation, they spit out like 200 topics spread out between Army, Navy, Air Force, etc. And here's one example: ultra-low power electronic health monitoring system. So some of this may seem applicable to you guys, but then they specifically want ultra-low power sensors and signal processing chains. It's not shown here, but below they say, I want you to do this in phase 1, and they lay out the task that you actually need to complete. So DoD can be even more specific, so it's harder to find a match here, I guess my point is. But there are health-related topics. So we mentioned 3 agencies: NSF, NIH, NSF, DoD. There's 9 others, and there may be a match at one of those other ones. For example, USDA sometimes have some health-related things in there. So be sure to check all of them. Although some you can probably mark off the list, like NASA a lot of times, or Homeland Security. But again, SBIRs are your best shot if you're a small business. If you're not a match for SBIRs, if you're not eligible, here's a few things to consider. One is DoD Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. So a lot of you guys may not know this, but they're funding breast cancer here. So DoD does fund health research. The good thing about some of these DoD applications is you get to submit a pre-proposal first, meaning they're going to tell you yes or no, spend hundreds of hours on a full proposal before you have to spend hundreds of hours on a full proposal. That's a good thing about DoD. The bad thing is there may be some cronyism for some applications. We talked about NIH non-SBIRs earlier. It sounds like a lot of you are familiar with R21s, R01s. Again, it's not ideal for small businesses, but maybe an R21 would suit you. You don't really talk about commercialization on those, however. And then also, there's this is an R01 that says academic industrial partnership or et cetera. So this specifically requests industrial or business collaborators. So something like this may be more appropriate than your basic science R01s. Oh, and then finally, foundations. There are foundations, some of them fund companies. However, don't get your hopes up when you do your foundation search because the large majority only fund professors and universities. I think one example is there's a MS Foundation funds companies. Yeah. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Kian. He's going to talk about registration.
So in order to submit an application, SBIR or STTR application, you're going to have to complete some registration steps. These are fairly straightforward. Most of the beginning steps are the same no matter what agency you go towards, but later on they deviate what you have to actually do. All these registration steps throughout the process are free of charge and paid for by the taxpayers' dollars. You don't have to put any bills for any of these registration steps. It's essential to complete these registration steps in a timely fashion. A lot of the steps have several day to 2-week bottleneck in between proceeding to the next step. So you definitely want to make sure you get taken care of early. Towards submission deadlines, the agencies become inundated with requests for registrations. So a lot of times you can get hung up in that process and lose hundreds of hours of work in the application because really the agencies that accept the applications are very not allowing of late submissions due to failure to register. They'll simply say, try again next time. There's no permissiveness there whatsoever. So for both NSF and NIH grants, you're going to have to start off by obtaining what's called a Duns and Bradstreet number for your company, just referred to as Duns usually. This is a pretty straightforward process. You just call the Duns and Bradstreet, provide some basic information about your company. They'll provide you a number shortly later, and you're going to use that throughout the application process to identify your company for the grants. Once you obtain that Duns and Bradstreet number, you'll be able to go to the System for Awards Management, formerly known as CCR, and essentially what this allows you to do is manage your award. And they want you to do that very early when you want. So you go to the SAM site, as it's called, and you simply register. They'll assign you a individual called eBiz point of contact, or eBiz POC, and also give you a number called MPIN. And you don't really need to keep track of what those are at this point, but just like you need them for future registration steps. And so once you complete SAM, get your MPIN, and you get point of contact, a recent addition that they've added to registrations is you actually have to go to the SBA, Small Business Administration website, and register your company there. It's a brief process, filling out some basic information such as your DUNS and things. And you'll end up printing out a unique PDF. And that PDF is going to be attached to all SBIR applications as an attachment. If you fail to attach that, they're not going to review the application. This has only come up in the last year or so. So make sure you get these done as soon as possible. At this point, once you get those three done, depending what agency you're going after, the SBIR, STTR registration requirements are going to kind of deviate, as I was saying. Let's say if you're doing an NIH application, what you're going to be doing is after you register for SAM, about a day or so later, you're going to take the information from SAM that you require and go over to a site called the Operational Research Consultants, the ORC. Once you're at the ORC, it's a very simple process. You carry over the information that you were provided during the SAM process, and you're done with that step. After that, this is the major step, but you're going to go to grants.gov and register there as an authorized user. You're going to set what's called AOR accounts, and you're going to have a username and password for that. And really, when you actually finally go to submit the application, you're going to be submitting through grants.gov. When you're clicking submit, I want to submit this, you're going to be entering your AOR username and password. So essentially, if you want to get your application submitted, you need to get that done before the deadline and have it all in order. After you do your AOR, the final step for NIH is to go to a site called ERA Commons. ERA Commons is where you're going to check on the status of your application, summary statements, application scores, and things will be viewed there. It's a pretty straightforward process, online registration, followed by submitting a fax form to the government. Very antiquated, but yes, they still require fax, so make sure you have that. And really, that's it for NIH. After that, so you just go to grants.gov and should say approved, you'll be ready to submit your application. For NSF, there's kind of a similar process to grants.gov. It's called NSF Fastlane. Fastlane is very intuitive. They provide very detailed step-by-step instructions on how to do it. Very straightforward. You should be able to get it done today. But the key thing to remember here again is register early as possible, because these things can get hung up for months sometimes if information is missing. You don't want to miss out on the submission chance. So, okay.
You mentioned AOR. What is that?
AOR accounts, that's essentially your main grants.gov account that you're going to log on with. It's going to allow you to assign roles, for example. You're going to be able to say, this person's our principal investigator, these are our co-investigators, yes. It's just an interface to work with.
There's websites that step you through this process.
Right. So moving away from registrations here, now we're going to talk about the Standard Form 424. Standard Form 424 is used by the NIH and several other SBIR, STTR agencies. If you've done an RO1, you're probably familiar with this. Essentially, this is the application package. It's a large PDF file. You enter your company information, anything that you're going to be submitting to the agency, such as your research strategy, bio sketches, references cited. All of that gets embedded within the SF424 file. And ultimately, what you're going to do, you see Save and Submit up here. Once you get everything attached, you click Save, Submit. It's going to bring up a little prompt, enter your AOR username and password. You enter that, you digitally sign it, and the application is submitted. So you definitely want to become very well familiarized with this. Next slide, please. Okay. So the SF424 is going to contain several fields. You can see here the essential ones are marked in yellow, and it's many pages. And it just collects information on things such as the key personnel, the budgets, other essential information. And as I say, you can attach everything here. It's fairly user-friendly, but it does have some limitations. It frequently doesn't catch errors. It would ultimately defense submission. For example, we were working with a out-of-country site and had a lot of strange like umlauts and things and names, irregular characters essentially, that actually will bounce an application back. So if you're not conscious of that, the SF424 will tell you that regular characters and prevent submission, but you need to be aware of that. Similarly, other things like non-standard paper sizes. For example, give a letter of support from UCLA for a collaborator, and you print it on a non-standard paper size, and you attach that, it's going to be bounced back. So this doesn't check for everything. You do need to have some knowledge of what's going on with the application. But another thing with the SF424, it's made by the government. It's been around for a long time. It's, even on most modern machinery, very slow. The computer that came out yesterday, consumer hardware, I mean, it's going to take 2 minutes to save even on that. It's just a very slow form, so even changing fields will take a long time. So allow yourself a good amount of time to fill this out. It does ask for some unique information that you may not have off the bat for everybody. For example, a collaborator, you might enter their mailing address and congressional district and DUNS number, and you don't want to be stuck scrambling for that on the day of submission. So just like registration, fill out the SF424 early. It's not difficult information, but you want to have it available as soon as possible to send time. Now, moving on here, one of the key things within the SF424 is the budget section. There's always going to be a main applicant budget section within the SF424, but if you also have other subawards and consultants and contracts and things like that, you may also have little subaward budgets which look very similar to this one that are exported from the SF424, filled out, and reattached. But we're just going to go over the main one here and go through some of the main points of interest. You can start up here. Of course, you have organizational DUNS that you clean from DUNS data sheets. You enter that there. Budget types, this is the main budgets and your project budgets. And after that, so you have senior key persons. With senior key persons, they're going to be individuals with significant scientific inputs. Pretty much if they're in the this section, you're going to want to also have a bio sketch for them, have them very well described within the budget justification section, which is essentially a small narrative outline where everyone's doing while they're doing it. Typically, people like consultants and people on subwards aren't going to be included in the key personnel. Usually, they're going to be on a subward budget or on a different line item. Moving along here, you're going to have other personnel. These are individuals such as laboratory technicians and more support staff that are going to help the senior key personnel. You don't really need to name them individually or provide a bio sketch for them, listing out their CV or anything like that. But you do want to say in the budget justification, this is what they're doing. The person to do it's to be determined. And we'll take it from there. One thing to note here is when looking at senior key personnel, nobody's going to be working 100% of the time. Even 50% of the time is unlikely. Typically, when applications get principal investigators working between 0.6 calendar months to about 2.4 calendar months for a 6-month project, that's usually about what we see. So you definitely don't want to put 6 months at 6 months if you're just fucking say that's reasonable. Moving on here, we have travel expenses. Usually for an SBIR, you're going to want to keep it domestic. This is going to cover airfare, fare, whatever travel you want to do, room and board. And these are very common for subawards, where you're going to have a PI going over and visiting the collaborating site to make sure everything's set up right, exchanging information. They'll cover a fair amount of money there. Also, NSF opportunities typically will require that the PI attend some kind of seminar or a conference to discuss the particular work. Usually that's going to require them up to Washington, D.C. or Baltimore. And that can include expenses. Okay. And after that, you have another section here, other direct costs. You can see there's many sub-line items under that. Material supplies, this is going to be largely consumables under $5,000. Things like if you're running histology slides, things like that. Lower cost items that are consumed for the most part. Then a consultants line item. Here, you don't need to name consultants out, of course. In the budget justification, we want to, but for your consultants, you just want to possibly include the bio sketches to highlight their expertise, why you bring them on, but you don't need to name them here, just the total amount of their requirement. Then for the final item there we're going to discuss subaward, consortium, contractual costs. These are outsourced costs. Say, for example, you need assistance in veterinary work, or for example, you have a CROs, research organizations, manufacturing device, that would also be outsourced. Whether or not you're going to need a sub-award budget depends on the complexity and nature of the work. If it's routine services, such as here, take these samples, do PCR, it's just routine. You really don't need to include a sub-award budget. But if it's something like we're going to send our individuals over to this facility to perform animal studies, and they're going to help with these veterinary aspects, you're probably going to want to lay out what their facilities are. So we're here to understand qualifying for the animal. It's really a matter of discretion there. Moving on here. Indirect costs, these are allowed for universities and are also allowed for small businesses. Typically what you refer to indirect costs as is facilities and administrative costs. The percentage that you can use varies. Typically what we find is reviewers will allow about 40% negotiated. You can negotiate that later down the line, but usually 40% will be negotiated from parties and take it acceptable. And that's based off the indirect cost base. One thing to note that's very unique to SBIR, STTR applications is the fee section. Essentially, the fee allows you to take up to 7%. We recommend taking 7% in all instances. This 7% can be applied to anything you want. If the PR wants to go on vacation after the thing, he's allowed to use for that. Essentially, it's money that's being given to the small business just as a fee for the sake of doing the work.
And real quick, so in the government, it's basically because the business is taking on a risk. It's not a university performing research. That's why the fee is in there. You know, Friday, you can do whatever you want with the fee. But yeah, that's why it's there.
Yeah, pretty much just progress. And then the final line item here, you're going to see a lot of these in SF424 add attachment. Here this would be the budget justification. You're going to write your budget justification in your Word format, describing what each of the individuals each slide does within the budget. You can convert that to a PDF, add the attachment, and you're ready to go. And here's some download. Yes.
What justification do you write for the fee?
For the justification for the fee, you really don't need much, just one line item. We've included 7% fee, which is aligned with standard practices, something of that nature.
You don't describe it. Just put the number.
Yes, for the fee, they pretty much accept 7%. If you went above, you probably want to describe it, but 7% should be fine.
Yeah.
And another thing, one final thing to note here is this just covers 1 year. If you have multiple year projects, there's an option to duplicate the budget for each year. You want to have a separate budget for each year. Because, of course, the individuals involved will change over the course of the years, and things like that. And really, that's the SF424 budget in a nutshell. I'm going to go back to Jacob and then continue. Thank you.
All right, so many of you are very familiar with grant writing, it sounds like, but for those that aren't familiar, it's a happy medium between your high school English, where there's a lot of transitions, a lot of big adjectives, real fluffy language. The mix between that and your scientific law writing, which is short, to the point, get to it and back it up. So you want to tell a story, you want to capture the reviewer's attention, but you have to back up your science. This is an example here. Back up your science with literature, just like similar to a research publication. But this is just a short example. The claims that they make, each number obviously is a reference. So they're backing up what they're saying with references. So we kind of touched on the review process, but typically NIH, there's 10 to 15 in a review group, and only three or four read your application from top to bottom. If you're in the upper half or top 40%, then it'll be moved to the 10 to 15 and they'll discuss it. If not, then it's not discussed. But if it's moved to the discussion, then the others probably look at your specific aims, which is 1 page, and they probably scan through your research strategy, which is 6 pages for phase 1. And they look for key information. So that's why the specific aims are very important, and that's why it's very important to be organized. And organized in the sense that you have topic sentences, that each topic sentence, that's your paragraph. That's what your paragraph is talking about. And use paragraphs. Don't have a 1-page paragraph. People don't like to read that. I don't like to read that. You don't like to read that. Neither do reviewers. Another thing, use headings, use tables, figures. When reviewers see a lot of blocks of text, and when I see it, it doesn't make me happy. But when you add in figures and add in headings that describe what you're talking about in those paragraphs, it's more enjoyable to read, and it's easier to scan through, capture the important information. So Now we're going to go over those two main sections, specific aims and research strategy. And the big disclaimer here, there's many ways to skin a cat, there's many ways to write a successful phase 1 application. So here's our suggestions that we have found successful. So specific aims, it's like your normal grants at the beginning. Start with your problem, talk about current solutions and limitations, then talk about how your product solves those problems and limitations. Then talk about your long-term plan, which includes a little bit about phase 2 if phase 1 is successful, which also includes your commercialization goals and what's the end product, what are you going to sell in the end. Then you go into the specific aims. At the least, provide a little summary of the approach and provide a summary of the milestones for each aim, such that if you're getting the award, people outside of your organization can look at your results and say, yes, they achieved their aims. This is a successful phase 1. They should get a phase 2 if they write a good application. Research strategy starts off a lot like the specific aims for the significance, and as in that you have your problem, your current solutions, how your product solves it. I mentioned this earlier. The commercialization part, that's not required, but you do suggest at least put in a paragraph about, here's the market, here's the commercial potential of this product and why it will achieve success. And backing up a little bit, there's 3 required headings: significance, innovation, approach. The rest of this is up to you. So innovation, what makes the product, and if it has been developed up to this point, what has made that development novel? Why is it unique? And you want to emphasize in this part how it stands out from the competitors, how it stands out from the current state of science. Next up is the approach, and often this is one of the harder sections to convey to the reviewers everything. What we like to do is start off with an overview of the team and kind of a summary of the approach with the timeline laying out. Aim 1 is 6 months, Aim 2 is 3 months, etc. Then you go into the preliminary data and say, here's our data, and here's how it backs up this specific project. Then you go into the specific aims, and each one is a section by itself. Give a rationale. Why are you doing this aim? Why is it important? Talk about the approach. Give the technical details that a scientist would understand. 3, give the expected outcomes or the milestones, again, some of those specific aims that people can tell whether or not you're successful. Finally, reviewers like to know that you've thought about potential problems, that you have the foresight to know what could go wrong. Not only that, but how you're going to fix what could go wrong. So make sure you talk about that also. And again, do this for each aim. So that covers the crash course in terms of an overview of the SBIR, what goes into it. So we're going to go into a case study, but I want to open it up to any questions that may have came up. I know we've asked some, but do we have any other questions?
So I think so far you have described that if there is a company, then how a company can apply for a grant. SAM, and then you have to register and then apply for this grant. How does one get to a point where he has a company and then he is now ready to apply for these grants? Because when you file the SF-424, one of the things that you would have to attach is the facilities statement and your collaborators or whoever subcontractor. So if I don't have a company, I cannot really approach a subcontractor. If I don't have a company, then I cannot really have facilities, and I cannot really prepare this SF-424.
Yeah.
So how do we get started?
No, yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of times, that's how a lot of companies start. It's from the university. Flows out of that. So, you do have to have an established legal company. You have to have a legal company name. And that's part of the DUNS is having I think it's your IRS, remember the name, the IRS tax identification number. So you have to have that for a company. In terms of facilities, if you don't have anything, you are a tough spot. Like I said earlier, you can say, if we get this grant, we're going to lease these facilities, and here's what these facilities have. So you can say that, but you need to make it clear that that's something feasible. Like you probably want a letter from those facilities saying, yes, these facilities are available if this grant is made.
But you're saying ideally there should be a company should already be running, should have the facilities available to that running company in the facility.
It's easier that way, especially because the percentages we mentioned before. You need to have a certain amount of funds going through company personnel. So if nobody's hired by that company and getting paid by that company, it's going to be tough. I mean, you can hire some people part-time, but you have to, the onus is for you to convince the government that you're not a virtual company. So that it is easier if you're already established, I guess, to answer your question.
So how does one get the initial capital so that they can do the hiring before they even apply for it?
That's outside of us. That's true. That's true. Melanie pointed out, we talked about STTRs earlier. So in those, up to 60% can go through the university. And so if you are very, very early, that's probably your better bet because it's less of a hurdle to jump over in terms of making that percentage and having those facilities. Because if you get a stellar PI at that university and you get the right collaborators, then you'll have a pretty good application. So yeah, good point.
Also, if you invented something in your lab and you've gotten it worked out with the university, that makes it a lot easier to get one of these grants. So if you're a professor and a student and you decide you want to start a company, if you have IP that's centered around, then it's a lot easier. You can get by with some of these solutions Jacob mentioned, like saying you're going to lease a facility or getting the university to agree to the space that you're working in as a student or a postdoc.
I think she was first.
Would securing a grant be more attractive to VCs, or if you already have VC funding, would that be better in applying for a grant?
I think it works a little bit both ways. I mean, as long as your VC isn't taking over most of your ownership, which usually it's not early on, that's also kind of a feather in the cap saying to reviewers that, yeah, our company's good enough that we've gotten some initial funding. And really, most of the time, companies have received some type of funding like that to get to that point. Because as you mentioned, I mean, you have to get funding somewhere. So if it's not grants, it has to be somewhere else. And then in reverse, it also works that way too, because like I mentioned earlier, this is a way to vet your project and your company, and it's public. I mean, you can just refer to NIH Reporter, the link where you received a grant, and show that to the venture capitalist, and that has to mean something. And
can you budget or use the budget form to allocate for like the transfer fees of licensing IP, even if it's your own? So even if you invented the thing, the university is still going to charge you to use it, say on your IP.
So licensing fees.
Right. So if you invent something at a university, they own that. You don't own that; they own that. So if you want to start a company based on it, you still have to pay the university to use your own technology. It's usually not a whole lot. But most universities require competition for that, etc. And they need to see that you're going to be able to pay for it.
Yeah, in general, legal fees, study time, things like that are not a lot. So I don't think so.
Yeah, we haven't come across licensing itself. Like she said, you can't say you're paying for me to get IP. That won't work. But there is some cases like you can pay for a intellectual property consultant, but not to like pay for the fees. You know what I mean? So licensing, that's a good question. I'm not sure just because we haven't come across that. I have to look that up. I think somebody over. Okay. You get a question? What's that? Okay, yeah, so again, we're Paradigm Partners. Our main business is R&D tax credits, which is for established companies, but our division is for grant writing, and we mainly work with small businesses. Although, yeah, mainly work with small businesses. And essentially what we do is step you through this entire process in terms of giving you instructions for registration, and then start with the drafting, start with specific aims, have calls with the client, and then once we get the specific aims and the general outline, try to do some background literature review and fill out the research strategy as best we can. However, a lot of things like approach details, budget details, facility details, that has to come from the client. So we essentially try to take most of the burden off the client and do a lot of time-consuming stuff, but there's always some work, like getting letters of support from collaborators that the client has to do. So that's essentially how we work. But talk to me after that, because I want to get these guys just in case they have a technical question, but come and talk to us afterwards. Well, like we mentioned earlier, the 7% fee is however you want to use it. Part of it can be indirect costs also. Yes?
So can you include regulatory consulting fees as well as part? So for example, in phase 1, as part of preparations for phase 2, the citation plan, it's important to have the regulatory milestones. So with the consultant during the phase 1 grant.
Yeah, some reviewers, we put that in there, some reviewers kind of don't like it, but they still approve the budget. So you can put it to an extent, I think, as long as you don't get out of it. And somebody else in the back before you like to, okay, go ahead.
For the SBIR, since the PI has to be, for the SBIR, 50% employed at the business, what are the implications for naming someone besides the actual PI as the PI for the grant? Does that hurt your chances of getting the grant a lot, since the senior researcher isn't listed as the PI?
Are you talking about STTR? Because SBIR, it has to be through company 50%.
Right. So for SBIR, the PI has to be hired by the company, essentially, right? So who determines, or what determines who the PI is? You list someone as the PI of the grant. Is it a ridiculous mistake to list someone besides the senior researcher as the PI of the grant? In case, for example, the senior researcher, your advisor from your PhD, for example, is not hired by the company.
It's not a fatal flaw. Like, we have some applications where they have a strong team of university collaborators, and none of them are the PI, and then maybe a junior researcher, maybe just with their PhD a few years. So those type of grants get funded all the time. But usually they look at the overall team, and usually you don't want to put someone in that role that has like a bachelor's, and you want someone with a PhD probably. Or if it's a different kind of grant that's more focused, maybe someone with a lot of experience in their field, like engineering or something like that. But yeah, it's not a fatal flaw. But if you have a more junior person in that role, they need to have good education, and overall a strong team.
I think was their background. I think, yeah, very background.
For the STTR, how does that work for the IP? Because like there's like somebody from the university or that, like, is there any like IP problem because of the fact that somebody is? So does your company is like stuck with all the like IP stuff from the institution with you're dealing? Does that make sense?
When you do the STTR, you're supposed to make an agreement between the business and the university. And so you don't have to submit that agreement to NIH, but it's understood that when you submit the application, you have that agreement, and if you're awarded the grant and they do an audit, then you're supposed to provide them with that. So you can make whatever deal you need to with the university on that, but you are supposed to have that sorted out in writing.
And then there's a few rows up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the people that review the grants? Is it a equal balance between scientists and people with business training, or is it mostly scientists?
I know NIH wants it to be a 50-50 mix, but it's typically at least 70% academics, I think. And then there's like 30% companies. So And one good point, like, and this is kind of touching on that, the reviewers are all different. I mean, even if it's academics, they could have different specialties. And one guy could be acute radiation syndrome specialist, the other one's a statistician. Statistician really likes the project, but acute radiation guy says, oh no, this part's wrong. So you could get really good scores in a couple, and then one knocks it down. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, do you really, if you know your technical side really well, but you're kind of fuzzy on the business numbers, what's going to happen there?
Like I mentioned earlier, the business side of it, it is much more important for NSF phase 1. For NIH, you do want to let them know you're knowledgeable of it and display that enough that they want to come to phase 1. Phase 2 at NIH, you definitely need a lot more because the commercialization plan is 12 pages for phase 2. So I would say, I mean, you're not going to get killed by it necessarily, but they do bring it up in terms of this is a good project, but for example, they brought up in the past, yeah, but this product is out there and it holds all of the market. Like, you didn't make a good case about how you're going to compete against that product. So if you haven't done that type of research, like, you need to know the field at the least. If that makes sense. Okay. Any others? Should we start the case study here?
So when you mentioned case study, the case study, the specific aims in a research grant proposal, you basically say what kind of research you're trying to do and the specific aims you plan to achieve at each stage. But in a SBIR grant, what do you do? Like, you want to mention how you're going to develop the product at every stage.
No, it's actually it's going to be very similar. It's just your aims were set up with a different goal. The goal is ultimately commercialization. So, for example, an aim could be doing certain animal studies to prove feasibility in phase 1, and then phase 2 is doing, larger animals or doing different studies that the FDA requires because that's what's required to get to commercialization. Okay, one more question, then we'll go ahead and start with the case study.
You mentioned for SBIR that it's less than 500 employees. From your experience, is that like you have more or less chance if you have 2 employees versus like 300? Like, do you spend more chance having like a big, small business?
In our experience, we've never seen a company more than 100 for sure. I think most of them are under 50 and 20.
Yeah.
No, maybe some.
I would say average size is like 4 to 20.
Yeah.
We see a lot of applicants be successful in about 10 circular.
Yeah, that 500, almost everybody is a small business.
I think I have an answer for that. I don't think a project is going to be successful if there are 300 people on it. So I think
that's right.
More than 8 to 10 people are maximum that can work on a project.
He means how many people are at your company when you apply.
In my experience, I don't think it really matters because when the reviewers look at the grant, they are looking at will this project be successful. So whether they are 10 people or 300 people, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. Okay. Melanie, you're up.
Okay, so what we're going to do right now is look at a case study. And we've put together, Kian's handing them out, 2 different companies, 2 different projects, and 2 different proposed products. So these are actually loosely based on some real SBIR projects, or at least applications that we've seen. And when you first get it, just read over it, and then we're going to take a poll, and what you're trying to decide is which company and which project do you think is more likely to be successful in getting an SBIR. And, oh yes, up on the overhead, this is a solicitation that recently came out from NIH, National Cancer Institute, and there's a little bit of language here so you know what opportunity they're responding to. And so right now we're doing task number 1, just read it and determine which application is most likely to be funded. everyone had a chance to look it over? Anyone have an opinion? Okay, so raise your hand if you think Watson Medical would win the contest here. Anyone? Okay, we got some takers. All right, now who thinks Euclid Health is in a better spot? Okay, have some people agree with that. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we're going to give you the scoring guidance and scorecard. These are actually the reviewer criteria, and so we can pretend like we're in a review session and we're each ranking each of these applications. Of course, you don't have the full application, you only have the details we provided, so you'll have to do your best. So if you look at the right side of the sheet they're handing out, for each company we've listed 5 criteria: significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. And when you submit your application, it will be assigned to a review group, and then 3 reviewers will score your application in this manner on each of those 5 criteria. And so if you look at significance, this is basically is the problem you're trying to solve, is it either widespread or is it a very severe problem? Is it a very important problem? And then investigators is just, do you have the appropriate expertise, whether through your employees or your consultants, to carry out the project? And then innovation, is this a innovative idea? Is it using novel technologies or methods? And this is actually one of the biggest complaints we see from reviewers. They say, well, this application is incremental. It's only a small step forward. It's not that significant. And at the same time, however, some incremental innovations, if they're applied in the field, can have a really widespread impact. So you have to keep that in mind as you think about innovation. And then the approach is the biggest part of the application. It's also one of the hardest things to get right for the reviewers, because there's so much information in detail about procedures, and they're most likely to pick on this section. And then finally, your environment, that's essentially, do you have the facilities needed to carry out the work that you describe in the grant? And it can also mean, is there a community of scientists, whether that's like a startup community or a university community that can contribute intellectually to your company's scientific development. So then if you look at the other side, this is the ranking scale that NIH uses from 1 to 9. So 1 would be a perfect score. So 9 would be the worst score. You don't see very many 8s or 9s or very many 1s. Most reviewers will give you something in the middle. And so for each application, you go through and you rank each of these 5 criteria, give them, a 1 through a 9. After the reviewers go through and individually rank your application, then they meet together with their whole panel. And the top half of the applications are scored and discussed by the group, and then the bottom half are not discussed. So the score that you'll receive is between a 10 and a 90, with 10 being a perfect score and 90 being the worst possible score. So usually to get your application funded, you need something in the range of 20 to 30. It used to be a little more lenient, but because of budget cuts, it has to be a little bit better now. We need a few more minutes. Are we all ready to go? Um, all right. Well, first, did anyone's opinion change after looking at the ranking criteria and system? Anybody? Yeah, a little bit. It kind of wasn't fair to.
What made it change? Just curious.
Significance.
Significance.
Okay, so Jacob and I actually did this independently before the session, and there's actually a lot of variation between reviewers, so it was interesting to see where we agreed and disagreed. So I'll just go through and talk about each of the 5 criteria and how we scored them and based on what factors. So looking at significance first, I mean, both companies are looking at aspects of cancer. That's obviously a very big problem, and according to the case study, they both have recent studies supporting their solutions, so, or supporting that this is a big problem. So for those, we gave an average ranking of 2.5, which is pretty good for significance. In looking at investigators can really make or break your grant. And in this case, Watson Medical, they have the guy who discovered the technology, and they have his advisor who's a world expert in the field. So that's really solid. We gave them a 2. The one thing that reviewers might say is that it doesn't look like anyone on that team has any commercialization experience. So reviewers will say that, but that's probably not a deal breaker for them. Then looking at Euclid Health, as far as investigators go, the major problem with this company and this grant is that they have a lot of business experience, but they don't seem to have anybody on the computer side, like the health informatics product. They don't seem to have any experts in that area, and they don't seem to have a recognized oncologist on their team. So that could be a problem with investigators. We gave them a 4. And
And that, I don't know, it seems like a lot of you raised your hands for Euclid Health, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe it's because you saw the business side and thought, this is SBIR, so some people thought that was SBIR, so yeah, they're probably better. But really, that's still not the case. You still have to have that science. So that's why Watson scores better for investigators for that, even though Euclid seems to be set up to make money. NIH still cares about the science. A lot of times, you could, like for example, you have a drug delivery client on Parkinson's disease. They're very experienced in their device and the physics of it and everything else, but they didn't have a Parkinson's disease expert, like a consultant. You know, just give them 10 hours at $250 an hour, bam. They didn't have that. And so they got slammed for not having that expertise. So in terms of business versus science, the science still wins at NIH.
all right, then looking at innovation for Watson Medical, it seems like it's pretty good technology. However, in the field of pill boxes, that's kind of an expanding area now, so it's not completely new. You've probably heard of other devices like that. So we gave them a 3.5, and there's a lot of room for variation there. Some reviewers would rate it highly, and some would not. For Euclid Health, there's even more health informatics decision support EHR tools coming out right now, so we gave that a 4. There doesn't seem to be anything about this one that distinguishes it from the field of other new technologies coming on. But it's not terrible, so it's still a 4. Then looking at the approach, and this is where you might have some variation. When you look at the approach, one of the main problems is the approach set up so that it actually tests the feasibility of your product, whether or not it's going to make it to be a final product that's used by people. And so this can vary depending on the product. So looking at Watson Medical with the Watt box, the feasibility question they're answering is, does the technology work? Can we use this material to count the pills and relate it to the software? So I think a lot of reviewers would say, yeah, that's make or break for that product. If that feature doesn't work, it's not going to fit. If it does, it sounds like which is actually pretty high for an approach. Then looking at Euclid Health, there could be two ways of thinking about feasibility here. Does their health informatics technology work? Does their technology actually improve cancer treatment or use the guidelines by the oncologists? Or does it actually, is the barrier to feasibility whether or not the physicians are actually going to accept this software? So that's a different question entirely. So for Euclid Health, they've gone with that second question, and they've kind of assumed that the technology is going to do what they say it is, that it's going to help physicians follow the guidelines, and that this is going to have a positive impact on cancer treatment and health. So a lot of reviewers, especially at NIH, might slam that and say, well, first you need to prove your technology, and then worry about whether or not the physicians are willing to use the products. Actually, a lot of reviewers would also criticize it the opposite way. So you might want to have a small usability study and then a small study that tests the technology in the same grant. Okay, so the last one is the environment. And looking at Watson Medical, they have a lease in place to work at MIT. So that looks good. Looks like they have an excellent scientific environment there. So we gave them a 2.5. And then for Euclid Health, we gave them a 4 because it's not clear that they have any facilities other than their corporate headquarters. Like they don't seem to have a computer development lab, which would seem to be important for an application like this, or a medical testing facility. So it looks like they're primarily oriented to sell products, and so it's not clear that they have the facilities that they might need or the environment to do this kind of research and stuff. So anyway, so actually, like I told you, these were based on real applications, and the Wattbox idea, something from was actually funded several times by SBIR, and that was 5 or 10 years ago. But yeah, Euclid Health, we're still holding out hope for them.
So let me ask you guys. So we kind of scored it based on our experience and what we think the reviewers say. So was there anything about the scoring that we said that really surprised you that was really different than how you scored it in terms of comparing the two companies? Or are you guys going to NIH to review?
I didn't pay attention to the other criteria, but the most important one for me was significance. And I'm sorry I didn't listen to your ranking on the significance, but I think significance for Euclid Health is a lot more than compared to the Wattbox, because all they are doing is something which a person can do by themselves anyway. Whereas the significance of the Euclid Health project is a very critical unmet need for evidence-based medicine. And all other, everybody prescribes different kinds of treatments, and they all go by their own judgment. So if there is a correlation between each treatment, that would be a lot more beneficial than for a person who is relying on opening the box. And, but other than that, I also felt that there could be a lot better, or there could be a lot more significant applications of the technology which Wattbox is developing. And I feel like that they have completely focused on a very non-significant part.
Well, those are actually really great comments. And on the first comment, the CAN tree, the software application, that could have a very broad impact, as you said. And this is a point where reviewers or agencies might differ in opinion. What we found with NIH, they seem to like to fund very narrow things that are not so ambitious as to seem impossible. So like with CanTreat, they might go, oh, every single type of cancer, how can you have a solution? Because you might have an ovarian cancer specialist and a prostate cancer and cervix cancer. And they're all sitting there saying, you can't possibly do this with my cancer, it's special, it's different. So there are reviewers that would think like you, but there would also be reviewers thinking oh, that's too broad. And
A couple comments. Significance, part of that too for SBIR is commercialization. So reviewers think Euclid has a greater chance of commercialization, they may rank it better. But another point on that, for Euclid, in terms of the actual project, Melanie mentioned it, but there's a usability study, but where is it saying that their actual decision support system is better than what's out there? Like that's not clear. You have to make that really clear. And this isn't enough space to do that. And, you know, it's very hard for you guys to score it, I know, but you have to be able to say, yes, this works, and we're going to prove it here.
yeah, and your comment about the toolbox technology being used for other more significant things, that brings up an important point. If you have a platform technology, you want to propose as many different applications of it as you can, and in each application, point out that this is not only going to be advancing, you know, cancer, but this could also be used in weaponry, or well, weaponry is not good for NIH, but diabetes. and that is also contributes greatly to significance, how broadly applicable the results might be. So that's a good point.
Any other comments or surprises from? Yeah.
That's a question. Like, my surprise was how like good her scores were compared to like how I've heard it. Like, they kind of like were in the same, like, comparing one to the other was like pretty much the same grade, but like I didn't give it like 2 or 2.5, like showing them a lot of words. But which brings my question: when the lines for those things, does the absolute, so do they score them in absolute, or they take care of like the relative way that, like, you put like ones everywhere, like, and other people just like don't like it, but you're like, does your one everywhere will kind of like underbalance? You see what I mean?
Not really. I see what you mean. So the 3 reviewers are actually assigned to assign these scores, like we just did today, to your application. If you average 3 scores, that doesn't actually correlate to the score you receive. What happens is, like we're discussing it today, the 15 of them all come together and they discuss each application, and then they rank them relative to the other applications. So if all the applications in their panel are just excellent, you're going to get a really great score, but you might be in the 50th percentile. And you say, well, what happened? Well, there were just so many other excellent applications.
Yeah, another point, you know, they do this like you guys are doing. They write down their scores, and so you get that no matter what. If it doesn't get discussed, that's all you get. If it does get discussed, you also get a single number, which is your overall impact score. Which, like Melanie mentioned, it's not directly a formula, it's not directly correlated. So what can happen is they can score you good from this, then they have the discussion, and they say, okay, well, I rated it's called an overall impact score. That's what you get if you get discussed. And they can say, okay, well, originally I said 25, but after the discussion, these guys convinced me, I'm going to say 32.
Right.
So, and they don't necessarily change the criteria score after, you know, in that process. So, you know, it's kind of linear, but not always. Yeah.
You mentioned that there were 2 or 3 like rounds for funding. Is that are those decision rounds as well, or like, you know, are there decisions made during those rounds, or is there one deadline?
So it's typically, so December was the last one. December, April, August for NIH. So December, you should be getting the decision whether or not it was discussed. If it wasn't discussed, they'll just say it was no score, or they'll give you a number. So that should happen in February or March. So it's like 2 or 3 or 4 months later. Then, depending on the score, you can usually tell if there's a chance for funding. Like Melanie mentioned before, 35 and under, you have a chance. 30 and under, you know, depends on the agency. But they actually get together and decide that a month or 2 after the scores are released. So that's 5 or 6 months later.
Right. And then your project usually starts 4 months after you make the decision. So, but with sequester, that was all delayed. So So usually they have, as Jacob said, kind of a rotating stack of deadline. So there's 3 deadlines, 3 reviews, 3 funding decisions, and 3 start dates. But sometimes, like at the beginning of the fiscal year, they may hold back the funds a little and end up funding more applications at the end of the year. But if you're at that beginning and you got a good score and they don't fund you because they're holding back, they can fund you all the way up to the end. They can fund you at the second funding round. Third. But after the fiscal year is ended, your chance of funding is over. So, does that make sense? Okay.
Kind of.
Kind of, yeah.
So from submission time to getting actual money or being able to draw funds out, it can range between, I think it's 8 and 12 months maybe, if I'm remembering correctly, depending on those cycles. So, and that goes to planning. Like, if you're a company, you're doing a project now, you shouldn't be applying for that project because you can't fund stuff that you already did. It has to be future, projecting for the future. So if you have a project now, you should be looking for SBIR funding for that new project. Maybe you have some preliminary data, which some preliminary data is always better, and then you're trying to branch out to that 8 months, a year down the road. In terms of writing the grant, which that kind of came up, you need at least 2 months, especially if you're starting out early. If you're starting out on your own, first time ever, you probably need 3 or 4 months. You need to get all the registration in, plan everything out, get all these documents together, all the templates together. So next one is April, we're at January 16th, so we cut it really close. This is your very first time. Any other questions, or should we wrap it up?